Hello and welcome to Let's Study Half-Life 2. So this is now part 6 of a 7-part series, and so far in the series we've made it about halfway through the 8th chapter of Half-Life 2 out of 13 chapters in all. So we're about 60% of the way through the game, give or take a bit, depending on how hard you found the earlier sections and how hard you find the later ones. For this video series, I spent about 11 hours capturing the footage for the previous sections, and about 18 hours overall in my playthrough. Which actually does, work out, more or less exactly. We're 60% of the way through. But we only have 2 more videos out of 7, and actually I've decided that I want to get to the end of the game before the last video, since that one's going to be more of a general wrapping up of lessons learned, with an eye toward Half-Life 2's legacy. This episode is called Left Shift. It's the button you press to sprint when you're playing Half-Life 2 with a keyboard and mouse, and in this video we're going to be sprinting through the last 40% of the game. Obviously that means there's not going to be a whole lot of detailed analysis in this one, but I think that's okay. I've spent the previous 5 videos building up a large vocabulary of concepts for talking about Half-Life 2, and there's not much more I have to add to it. So even if I really took my time on the back portion of the game, I'd still just be pointing out more examples of things I've already said before. So might as well just hit that sprint button. Here we go. The latter portion of the Sand Traps chapter uses the Antlions to enact the logic of the children's game, The Floor is Made of Lava. It's always surprising to me how few video games riff on this idea. It's such an elemental form of play, like tag or hide-and-go-seek, and certainly there are plenty of games that riff off those archetypal forms. Sure, there are times where you see it being enacted in very literal ways in platformer games, but I don't see many other instances where the whole logic of a game world is built around the idea of avoiding stepping on something. Dying Light, with its innovative use of parkour and zombies, comes close here, I suppose. Anyway, Valve tested out here, and it's a nice change of pace. One problem, though, is that it does get tedious. Too much of this journey is just about alternating between standing on and moving to safe platforms. We have a boss fight against an Antlion Queen, and a Vortigaunt comes out and harvests some Antlion pheromone pods from it. This completely changes the mechanical logic of the Antlions. During their appearances for the rest of the game, they will be our allies.
Freeman will have need of these pheropods on the path ahead. Gather them now.
We have a moment where we're trained in how to wrangle them, and then we mount an assault on the Nova Prospekt prison complex, with them on our side. This section very cleverly reverses much of what the player had been trained to do during the Coastline Road Trip section. Before, these thumper devices were things we were trained to turn on, as they kept the Antlions at bay. Here, our relationship to them has been reversed, because our relationship to the Antlions has been reversed. And we need to turn them off as soon as we approach the prison, in order to allow it to be overtaken by our newfound allies. There's some fighting on the beach, where if we want to, we can stay mostly out of danger, guiding the Antlions to attack our foes. Eventually we breach the perimeter, fight off a gunship, and get inside the prison. In the prison we're introduced to Combine turrets, in a process of incremental escalation. The first time we see one is through a window, and then even when we get closer, it's still pointed away from us, separated from us by some bars. In this way, Valve can demonstrate that turrets are hazardous to our Antlion allies, without actually placing us in danger yet. The second time we see them more similarly protected. Here, the Antlions can overwhelm the turrets on their own, so even if we didn't knock over the previous ones ourselves, now we know that it can be done. The third time we encounter turrets, there's no longer a barrier of bars separating us from them. But they're still pointed away from us, so they don't present much of a danger. They're easy to knock over. The fourth time we encounter them, they are pointed at us. But by the time we can get close to them, they're far above us, and they're not particularly adept at pointing down. So it's easy to lob grenades up at them. We're in danger, but not that much danger. We still have time to think. This changes the 5th time we encounter them. Here we're being fired upon just as much as our antlion allies. This room is pretty darn dangerous, and it's essential to find a way to use the gravity gun to take out these turrets quickly. The next turrets we encounter are farther away, with a better line of sight on us. And some of them are even protected by force fields. Knocking these ones over is much more of a puzzle. It requires us to have a keen eye for vents, even when we're under heavy fire. We continue to use the antlions as allies. We can tell them to attack enemies. We can sacrifice them to defuse traps. But eventually, Valve runs out of new ways to use them, so they disappear from the level, and are replaced by Alex,
I'm glad you made it here in one piece.
who becomes a voice on the radio for a while,
Hey, it worked. Let's see what I can do to clear the way for you.
doing very typical voice on the radio things.
According to the schematics, there should be a vent behind those shelves.
Alex's ability to always know where we are in the prison and what door we're trying to get open is motivated by the prison's security system, which players have encountered themselves before in the level. Although, in actuality, it's hard to understand how Alex is able to use it as efficiently as she does, given its limited usefulness to the player themselves. Valve does try to use security feeds as a foreshadowing technique, letting players know what's up ahead, for instance maybe a boss fight against an antlion queen. But it doesn't work super well because it's impossible to suss out accurate spatial relationships between our position and the position that we're looking at. Still though, much of the environmental storytelling that we get in this chapter comes through security feeds. For instance, this is the only place in the game that we can see what Overwatch soldiers look like beneath their masks, giving us an idea of just how much their human form has been altered by the Combine. We also get some environmental storytelling outside of screens, for instance when we glimpse this Vortigaunt torture setup. Having thoroughly escalated turrets as a danger, Valve now does the same thing they did with the antlions, and introduces turrets as allies. Alex can reprogram them remotely, so we get to use them in a defend the room onslaught segment. This is the first of such segments in Nova Prospekt, and the second one is much harder. So I always like to retain one of the turrets from the previous encounter, and carry it with me to use in the next one. This involves some annoying things like having to get it through this electrified water puzzle. But hey, at least it does a good job of killing headcrab zombies. And I always find it's worth it because there's only 3 turrets in here, despite there being 4 points to defend. This is obviously strategic on Valve's part. They want this section to be very tense, for players to always feel shortchanged, in the midst of a continual sort of triage. But there's plenty of difficult bits coming up ahead, so I never feel guilty about cheesing this particular one. Despite the ramp up in difficulty that comes with Nova Prospekt, one nice thing about this section is that they do give you plenty of ammo for the plasma rifle alt-fire. It's always very satisfying to successfully bounce that energy ball around, so that it vaporizes everyone. We successfully rescue Eli Vance, but Mossman, who has betrayed us, steals him away again, and sends him to the Citadel on the Combine teleporter. So we return to City 17, in a segment that includes an exact reversal of our path through the game's first outdoor level. In this section, Valve fully embraces friendly NPCs. In an abrupt reversal from the loneliness that has characterized much of the campaign, we suddenly find ourselves with a 4-person squad, made up of any Resistance members we encounter during our journey, with new members cycling in to replace any who have died. As I went into in Part 3, friendly NPCs are very expensive, and this section is made possible by the fact that Valve cuts a few corners.
Dr. Freeman? We're coming with you.
These squad members harken back to the character types logic of Half-Life 1. Models and voices are reused freely, and sometimes we'll even have duplicates in our squad at the same time. Unfortunately, despite its ambition, this section suffers from some of the worst herding in the entire game. There are a couple of points I still get turned around in, despite playing the game a half dozen times or so. For instance, the door in this area that we're supposed to go to is architecturally hidden, and it's very poorly lit. If you notice, there's a crate of supplies next to it, which draws us in, but otherwise it's downright invisible from most angles. And during this moment at the gate, it's easy to assume that you're supposed to shoot these cops, but they actually keep spawning endlessly. What you really want to do is seek out a door over on the side and find another way around. This isn't too hard to find or anything, but the constant waves of people shooting at you are a huge distraction from what you're actually supposed to be doing. We finally get to fight a Strider, in a payoff to a moment of foreshadowing in the game's opening moments. And in fact, we don't just fight one. The first time we encounter them, we actually have to fight off 4 or so, in a very prolonged and intense battle. We're helped out here by other Resistance members, but for the most part they don't have the appropriate weaponry. So really this fight comes down to us. And speaking of foreshadowing, here we are. At the moment where we finally enter the Citadel. It has been a long time coming, but this is the final payoff.
I'll be damned. I think he wants you to go through, Gordon. You'd better hurry.
Inside, we hitch a ride on a prisoner transport system, and this finally gives us the classic Black Mesa Inbound type theme park ride that the opening of Half-Life 2 denied us. Much like in that first chapter of the original Half-Life, movement is taken out of our control here, and we're encouraged just to look around at some elaborately staged scenes that illustrate the Combine's production line for their instruments of war. Get dropped off at a security checkpoint, and all of our weapons get vaporized. But the gravity gun gets supercharged. In its enhanced form, it will be our only weapon for the rest of the game. We continue on, up and up, and up and up, and we end up in Dr. Breen's office. And to prevent his escape, Alex says that we need to climb to the very pinnacle of the Citadel.
Looks like he's turned over control to the other side.
And disrupt its dark energy reactor. And so we do so, in the game's final battle. And then as the Citadel's reactor explodes, the G-Man arrives to extract us.
Time, Dr. Freeman?
In a typically mysterious and extra-dimensional manner. And then, that's it. That's Half-Life 2. And now that this quick part is over, we can plunge into deep analysis one last time. So stay tuned, and thanks for watching.